August 20th, 1945. Honolulu internment camp, territory of Hawaii. The air was thick, a wet woolen blanket smelling of red volcanic dirt and moldering canvas. Nurse Tomiko Endo sat on the packed earth, her back rigid. The humidity caused the repurposed cotton mampe, the rough work trousers issued to them, to cling to her skin. Around her, 20 other Japanese women sat in silence, their faces hollowed by the impossible news of the past 5 days. The emperor was not a god. Japan had surrendered. She watched the American. He was not a soldier, not truly. He wore the same olive-drab uniform, but on his collar, she saw the small, glinting cross of a U.S. Army chaplain. He was kneeling in the dirt before Otsuna, the oldest of the civilian internees, whose joints had swollen with arthritis. The chaplain, Captain McCrary, held a simple tin basin of water. He was washing the old woman's feet. Tomiko felt a sharp, violent recoil. This was wrong. This was a defilement of hierarchy, an act of grotesque theater meant to humiliate them further. But the captain's hands were steady, his movements respectful. He did not preach. He did not smile. He simply cleaned the dirt from between Otsuna's toes. What hidden rituals of the enemy were yet to be revealed? If you are fascinated by the untold psychological conflicts of the war, follow our channel and share which country's history we should explore next. 6 months earlier, Manila, the Philippines. February 15th, 1945. Manila, the Philippines. The world was concrete dust and the smell of cordite. Nurse Tomiko Endo hadn't seen the sky in 2 days. She was in the cellar of what had been a Spanish mission, now just a hollowed-out collection of pockmarked arches. The air was too hot, vibrating with the non-stop percussion of American artillery, a deep, resonating thump that she felt in her teeth, and the answering, frantic chatter of the last Type 99 machine gun on their street. It had stopped chattering an hour ago. She was alone with 2 bodies, a young private, his face serene, and her senior nurse, who had used her last grenade on herself 3 hours prior. Tomiko's own suicide was overdue. Her conditioning demanded it. Capture was the final, unthinkable shame, a fate reserved for the weak, a betrayal of the kokutai. She held the cold steel of her empty syringe. She had used the last morphine on a dying corporal and pressed the blunt needle against her wrist, willing it to be sharp enough. A shadow blocked the cellar entrance. It was massive, silhouetted against the gray, smoky light. The figure was impossibly tall, helmeted, his shoulders broad under the straps of his pack. He moved with a heavy, predatory grace, an oni, a demon. He brought his weapon down. Not a bayonet, but the long wooden stock of an M1 Garand. Tomiko flinched, turning her head, bracing for the bone-shattering impact. "Hold fire! Jesus, hold your fire!" The voice was guttural, loud, American. Another soldier joined him. "Got one, Sarge. Female." "Medic," the first one yelled. Not at her, but back up to the street. "Get the medic. We got a live one." Tomiko opened her eyes. The demon was not attacking. He was looking at her with irritation, exhaustion. He kicked the syringe away, grabbed her arm, and cinched a plastic zip tie around her wrist with rough, practiced efficiency. She was cargo. She was alive. And as the Marine hauled her roughly to her feet and shoved her toward the blinding, terrifying light of the street, Tomiko Endo's world, her training, her beliefs, her emperor, shattered into a million pieces. The demon had failed to act as prescribed. Tomiko was herded with other captured civilians and a few nurses into the back of a canvas-topped U.S. Army truck. The ride was short, ending at a requisitioned schoolyard enclosed by barbed wire. Here, the process of dehumanization became systematic. The language barrier was a physical wall. The Americans shouted in harsh, barking syllables that meant nothing. They communicated with aggressive gestures: move, stop, sit, form line. The worst was the cleansing. They were pushed into a shower tent. Tomiko, clinging to the last shreds of her nursing professionalism, expected a medical examination. Instead, soldiers, male soldiers, stood by as they were ordered to strip. The women huddled together, their movements stiff with shame and terror. Tomiko turned her back, her hands shaking as she undid her frayed uniform. She expected the whistles, the leers, the violence promised by propaganda. It did not come. The soldiers looked bored. They were sprayed. A cold chemical mist shot from metal canisters, coating their skin and hair. The smell was acrid, metallic, clinging, DDT. They were then scrubbed with harsh lye soap and hosed down with cold water before being thrown rough, shapeless garments. U.S. Navy work fatigues, dyed a dark, indeterminate color. It was in the processing line, waiting for a number to be tagged to her new clothing, that she saw him. One of the other women, a civilian from Manila, stumbled and fell. A guard, young and red-faced, hauled her up and shoved her hard. "Hey, easy, son." The voice was different, not sharp, but carrying an authority that made the young guard freeze. A man in an officer's uniform approached. He was older, with a thin, tired face. He wore no weapons. On his collar, where insignia of rank usually sat, Tomiko saw a small silver cross. He knelt, spoke a few quiet words to the guard, who flushed and stepped back, and then offered the fallen woman a metal U.S. Army canteen. Tomiko stared. A figure of authority had deferred to a priest? The act was bafflingly gentle. It was inefficient. It was not the behavior of a conqueror. She filed the anomaly away, a piece of data that did not fit the equation of the Oni. This gentle American was a puzzle, and as they were marched toward the docks, Tomiko could not look away from that small, glinting cross. The transport ship, a cramped and reeking Liberty ship, deposited them in Hawaii. They were loaded onto trucks again and driven inland, away from the coast, into a deep, humid gulch that trapped the heat. The sign at the gate read, "Honolulu Internment Camp." The Nisei translator, a Japanese-American soldier whose presence was deeply unsettling, told them the camp's nickname was Jigokudani, Hell Valley. It was apt. The camp was a sprawling, hastily constructed city of tar paper barracks and canvas tents, segregated by wire. Tomiko and the other nurses were assigned to the women's POW compound, separate from the civilian internees, but sharing the same oppressive atmosphere. Here, a new rigid society had already formed. The Japanese, stripped of their former lives, had replicated the hierarchies of home with fierce precision. The barracks leader was a Mrs. Sato, the widow of a prominent civilian administrator from Guam. She was a stern, unyielding woman who saw herself as the guardian of their collective Japanese spirit. On Tomiko's first evening, Mrs. Sato assembled the new arrivals. She stood, back ramrod straight, in the dim light of the single exposed bulb. "We are prisoners, but we are not defeated," Mrs. Sato stated, her voice low and carrying. "We are Japanese. We will maintain our standards. We will not fraternize. We will not accept their gifts. We will not listen to their propaganda." Her eyes scanned the room, landing on Tomiko. "This includes the religious services. The American priest is a tool. He uses false kindness to poison your soul and make you forget who you are. Attendance is forbidden." Tomiko felt a chill, despite the crushing humidity. The order was absolute. She was now a prisoner twice over. She was trapped by the American barbed wire that surrounded the camp, and she was trapped by the rigid, watchful eyes of her own compatriots. She gave a slight, assenting bow, her face impassive. She would obey, but she would also watch. She would study this American priest, this Chaplain McCrary. She would understand how this particular weapon worked. The first Sunday after Mrs. Sato's decree, Tomoko kept to the shadows. She positioned herself at the far end of the barracks, near the latrine trench where the stench offered a plausible excuse for lingering. From here, she could see the patch of bare earth between two mess halls that the Americans used as a chapel. She felt a knot of profound disgust. This was the contamination Mrs. Sato had warned against. To even observe felt like a small betrayal. Chaplain McCrary arrived, carrying a small, boxy wooden case. He set it down and unfolded it, revealing a small keyboard. A Nisei soldier, the same translator from the trucks, joined him. Only 5 women attended, all older civilians sitting on a log bench. Tomiko braced herself. She expected the fanaticism she had seen in propaganda films, wild-eyed preaching, thunderous condemnations, the triumphant arrogance of the victor. McCrary began to play the small organ. His foot pumped a pedal, and a thin, reedy sound emerged. It was not a march. It was not a victory song. The notes were slow, forming a melody she had never heard, one that seemed to hang heavy in the humid air. The Nisei translator sang, his voice hesitant, in oddly formal Japanese. The words were foreign, but the feeling was not. It was melancholic. It was sad. Tomiko frowned, inching closer to the corner of the building. This was wrong. Why would the conquerors sing of sorrow? Grief was the property of the defeated. This was the sound she heard in her own barracks in the dead of night, the sound of stifled weeping. But here it was, in the open, led by the enemy. McCrary spoke, his voice too low for her to hear the English words, but the tone was conversational, not bombastic. There was no fire, no damnation. The weapon was not what she had anticipated. It was quiet. It was somber. And, most confusingly, it sounded less like a threat and more like a lament. She retreated, her scientific observation having yielded only deeper confusion. Weeks blurred into a monotonous, humid haze. The true enemy, Tomiko realized, was not the guards, but the idleness. As a nurse, her life had been defined by frantic, purposeful action. Here there was nothing but laundry, meager barracks cleaning, and the slow, grinding erosion of the mind. The women grew listless, their conversations turning repetitive and sharp. Sanity itself felt thin. One afternoon, Chaplain McCrary arrived at their compound, accompanied by a guard. They were not carrying weapons or prayer books. They were carrying a simple wooden crate marked with the red emblem of the International Red Cross. Mrs. Sato intercepted them at the edge of the barracks, her posture rigid. She and the Nisei translator exchanged tense words. "These are sanctioned comfort items," the translator announced to the women, who had gathered at a distance. "From the Red Cross and the YMCA, they are provided under the Geneva Convention." McCrary opened the crate. Inside were not luxuries, but small, practical items. Bars of soap, cheap notebooks, pencils, and several small mending kits, spools of black and white thread, with a few needles tucked into paper. He and the guard simply left the open crate on the packed earth and walked away. Silence descended. The women stared at the box. It was Mrs. Sato who spoke first. "Poison," she hissed, her voice loud enough for all to hear. "They are not gifts. They are insults. They are tools to make us soft, to make us forget." But Tomiko watched the other women's eyes. She saw the way Otsuna, the old woman with arthritis, stared at the thread. Her mampe trousers were splitting at the knee. Tomiko's own hem was unraveling. The utility of the items was a powerful, physical pull, a direct counter-argument to Mrs. Sato's ideological stand. To repair her clothes was to reclaim a small piece of dignity, a defense against the encroaching chaos. The box sat untouched for a day. a symbol of the schism. But on the second night, under the cover of darkness, Tomiko Endo crept from her cot. She quickly, shamefully, palmed a single needle and a small spool of black thread, concealing them in her waistband. It was a practical act, but it felt like a profound betrayal. The act of defiance, small as it was, seemed to break something inside her. Or perhaps it was the water, or the heat. Within a week, the camp's oppressive humidity felt like a physical weight, a hot, wet towel she could not remove from her face. Then came the cramps, a sharp, twisting grip deep in her gut that made her double over. Tomiko, as a nurse, knew the signs immediately: dysentery, sakiri, the bloody flux, the camp killer. She tried to hide it, using the latrine trench only under cover of darkness, but the fever came on too fast. It was not a gentle warming, but a violent, consuming fire. The tar paper walls of the barracks seemed to melt and warp. The voices of the other women, including the sharp, accusatory tones of Mrs. Sato, became a distant, buzzing drone. She was cold. She was burning. Her world shrank to the rough weave of her cot blanket. She was vaguely aware of being moved. Hands, rough but efficient, lifted her. The smell of the open air, volcanic dirt and canvas, was momentarily sharp, and then she was inside again, in a different barracks. The infirmary. It smelled of antiseptic and waste. Through a fog of delirium, she saw a shape. It was a man, standing over her cot. He was wearing the olive-drab U.S. Army uniform. An Oni, the demon. A primal terror, deeper than ideology, seized her. This was it. This was the end. They had isolated her, the weak one, to finish the job. She tried to resist, to summon the strength to die as a Japanese, to bite her own tongue, to claw at him. But her limbs were water. She could only manage a low, rasping sound. Her physical defenses had collapsed. And as the uniformed figure loomed closer, her ideological ones dissolved into pure animal fear. She did not die. She simply fell backward into a bottomless black unconsciousness, her life entirely in the hands of the enemy. She woke to silence. A deep, profound stillness, broken only by the sound of crickets outside the barracks. The fever had broken. The consuming fire was gone, replaced by a bone-deep weakness and a layer of cold, clammy sweat. Her mouth tasted of metal, the lingering tang of sulfa drugs. The infirmary was dark, lit only by a sliver of moonlight coming through the open door. She was on her cot. She was alive. She was not alone. In the corner, slumped in a simple wooden folding chair, was a figure. Her heart seized, a cold, frantic pulse, before she recognized him. It was the chaplain, McCrary. He was asleep. His head was tilted back against the wall, his mouth slightly open. The silver cross on his collar caught a faint gleam of light. He was not a guard. He was not an interrogator. He was simply sitting. Tomiko lay perfectly still, her breath shallow. She tried to make sense of the scene. The logic of warfare, as she understood it, had no place for this. He was not preaching. He was not performing a ritual. There were no other Americans here to witness his piety. It was not propaganda. It was strategically useless. He gained nothing. He was just a man, in a chair, keeping watch over a sick enemy prisoner in the middle of the night. This was the act she could not process. The demon in Manila who hadn't killed her, the melancholy hymns, the practical thread, and now this. This quiet, pointless, human vigil. It was an act of compassion so profound in its uselessness that it violated every piece of propaganda she had ever been taught. The Oni myth, the foundation of her hatred and her fear, did not just crack. It shattered. It dissolved into the quiet darkness of the infirmary, leaving her staring at the sleeping man with a new, terrifying, and profound sense of confusion. The enemy was not a monolith. He was just a tired man in a chair. When Tomiko was deemed strong enough to leave the infirmary, she returned to her barracks. The physical space was the same, the smell of sweat, tar paper, and damp earth, but the social atmosphere had crystallized against her. It was a tangible, cold pressure. The other women did not meet her eyes. When she sat on her cot, her neighbors shifted away, creating a small, clear buffer of empty space around her. She had been contaminated. She had received special treatment from the enemy, and worse, she had survived because of it. The confrontation came that evening, as the sun set and the single bulb cast harsh shadows. Mrs. Sato stood before her, flanked by two other senior women. It was not a discussion, it was an arraignment. "You accepted their aid," Mrs. Sato stated. It was not a question. Tomiko looked down at her hands, still thin from the fever. She felt the eyes of the entire barracks on her. The old Tomiko would have apologized, would have begged for forgiveness, would have promised to atone. The pressure to conform, to rejoin the group, was immense, a physical weight on her chest. "You allowed the techie priest to sit with you," Mrs. Sato continued, her voice dripping with contempt. "You showed weakness. You accepted his favors." Tomiko's head snapped up. She looked directly at Mrs. Sato, not with defiance, but with a strange, cold clarity. The ideological framework that had once governed her was gone, shattered in the dark of the infirmary. All that remained were facts. "I was dying," Tomiko said, her voice quiet, but carrying in the silence. "He gave me medicine." It was the worst possible defense. It was an admission, not an apology. It confirmed her crime. She had valued her own life, provided by the enemy, over the collective's mandate of ideological purity. Mrs. Sato stared at her, her face a mask of disgust. She said nothing else. She simply turned and walked away. The verdict was rendered. Tomiko was no longer just a prisoner of the Americans. She was an outcast among her own people. Isolation had an unintended consequence: freedom. No longer bound by the need to perform her loyalty for Mrs. Sato, Tomiko was adrift. The old world was gone, shattered by McCrary's vigil. The new world of the barracks had rejected her. All that remained was the question: why? It was no longer a strategic query. It was a desperate personal one. Why had he done it? The following Sunday, she did not hide. She walked, her steps measured, to the open-air chapel. She ignored the venomous stares from her own barracks. She sat on the log bench, in the very back, separate from the handful of other attendees. McCrary nodded to her, a simple acknowledgement, and began. Tomiko did not understand the English. The Nisei translator delivered the words in formal, stilted Japanese, but the concepts were alien, almost nonsensical. McCrary was reading from his small, worn Bible, and the translator spoke of turning the other cheek and blessing those who curse you. Then came the sentence that stopped her breathing. "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Tomiko stared at the translator, certain she had misheard. Love your enemies. Aishinasai. It was not a suggestion, it was a command. This was not just a different religion, it was a different species of thought. Her entire culture was built on the foundation of Hako Ichiu, 8 corners of the world under one roof, and the absolute, righteous, necessary destruction of any who opposed the emperor. Her hatred for the Oni had been a moral imperative, a pillar of her identity. And this man, this quiet American, was reading from a book that commanded him to love her. She looked at McCrary's face. It was earnest, tired. He was not a fool. He was not weak. But he believed this. This was the source of the vigil. This was the motive. It was not a tactic of war. It was a rejection of its very premise. She was no longer studying a weapon. She was studying a motive so profound, so fundamentally incompatible with her own, that it terrified her more than the Marines' Garand in Manila. What kind of God demanded the impossible? Her intellectual quest, her search for an answer, was suddenly interrupted by a new sound. Not a hymn. It was shouting from the camp commandant's office. An alarm bell began to ring. The service dissolved. Guards were shouting, ordering all prisoners to assemble in the main compound. The rumors, which had been swirling for days like toxic smoke, rumors of a new kind of bomb, of cities turned to ash, had reached a terrifying crescendo. They were marched to the central square. A large horn speaker had been affixed to the commandant's office, a wire snaking from it to a shortwave radio. The American soldiers formed a perimeter, their rifles held ready, their faces grim. They looked nervous. The Japanese prisoners stood in absolute terrified silence. Even Mrs. Sato seemed small, her face pale, her rigid posture gone. It was noon, August 15th, 1945. The radio crackled to life. A voice formal and stiff announced the emperor himself would speak to his people. Tomiko felt a wave of dizziness. This was impossible. The Ara Hitogami, the living God, did not speak. His voice was not for human ears. Then it came. A high-pitched, reedy, unfamiliar voice speaking in a highly formal, almost archaic Japanese that was difficult to parse. It was the Gyokuan Hoso, the jeweled voice broadcast. The air was thick with static, but the words were clear enough. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. Tomiko's mind refused to accept the words. She was looking for a command to fight, to resist, to die. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. A low moan began, starting with the older women. Otsuna, the arthritic woman, simply crumpled to the ground. Another woman began to beat her own head with her fists, but Tomiko felt nothing. It was not grief. It was not anger. It was an absolute, cold, black void. Her God had just declared himself mortal. Her nation, her sacrifices, her identity, the deaths of her colleagues in Manila, all of it had been rendered meaningless in the static of a radio broadcast. Mrs. Sato, her face a mask of utter, complete desolation, let out a single animalistic wail and collapsed. The compound erupted into a symphony of mass hysteria, wailing, fainting, catatonia. Tomiko just stood there, untouched. The war was over. Her world had ended, and she was completely, terrifyingly empty. The next 5 days were a descent. The camp structure dissolved. The guards, no longer managing prisoners of war, were managing a mass of traumatized, grieving women. The wailing had subsided into a thick, suffocating blanket of despair. Suicide attempts became a daily reality, a grim duty for the American medics. Tomiko remained in her void. She ate, she slept, she moved, but she was not there. The question of why McCrary loved his enemies had been replaced by a more terrible one. Why live at all? The emperor was mortal. Her purpose was gone. Suicide was not just an option. It was the only logical conclusion. On August 20th, Chaplain McCrary set up his field organ in the center of the compound. A few women, hollow-eyed and moving like ghosts, drifted toward the sound. Tomiko, drawn by a thread of memory, followed. She sat on the packed earth, her back rigid. McCrary spoke, and the Nisei translator relayed his words. He did not speak of victory. He did not speak of Japan's surrender or America's triumph. He spoke of grief. He spoke of the valley of the shadow of death. He spoke of a God who understood profound loss. Then he set his Bible aside. He picked up a simple tin basin of water and a rough cloth. He knelt in the red volcanic dirt before Otsuna, the old woman with the swollen joints, who stared at him with dead eyes. He took her foot. Tomiko felt the same sharp, violent recoil she had felt. Recontextualization. She felt, no, this was new. She'd seen this before, in a vision. Or was it this moment? He was washing the old woman's feet. The act was the same one she had glimpsed months ago. But she was different. Her god emperor, who sat on a throne far from his people, had been proven a man. And here was the enemy's god, represented by this quiet chaplain, kneeling in the dirt, performing an act of service for the lowest, most broken of them. It was not humiliation. It was not theater. It was humility. It was service. In the vast, cold black vacuum of her annihilated world, this single quiet act became an anchor. It was the only thing that made sense. A god who knelt. A god who served. She did not know if she believed, but as she watched him clean the dirt from Otsuna's toes, Tomoko Endo cried for the first time since Manila. The repatriation process was as methodical and impersonal as their capture. Their names were called, their identities confirmed against lists, and they were marched back to the docks at Pearl Harbor. The smell of the ocean, once a barrier, now represented a terrifying, uncertain passage home. Home. The word was a void. She was returning to a land she no longer knew, a land whose god had been exposed as a man, a land of ash and shame. The fear of what she would find there was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, a fear almost as profound as the one she'd felt in the Manila cellar. Tomiko stood in line on the gangplank of another gray Liberty ship, her few possessions in a small cloth bundle. Mrs. Sato was in the line ahead, her back still rigid, but she looked older, broken, and she did not speak to anyone. Nurse Endo. Tomiko turned. Chaplain McCrary was standing on the dock, looking up at her. He had a pack on his back, clearly moving on to his next posting. He walked up the gangplank, stopping a few feet below her. He didn't preach. He didn't ask her if she was converted. He didn't even smile. He simply held out a small, black, leather-bound book. It was worn at the edges, a U.S. Army issue pocket New Testament. For the journey, he said. The Nisei translator was not there, but she understood the meaning. She looked at the book, then at his face. This was the source, the motive, the command to love an enemy, the anchor that had held when the world dissolved. Tomiko Endo reached out and took the book. Her fingers brushed his. She gave a small, stiff bow. He returned it. She did not know if she was a Christian. She did not know what she believed. But as she turned and walked onto the ship, she held the small book tightly in her hand. It was not scripture, not yet. It was a symbol of a possibility. It was an anchor. And as the ship's horn sounded, a low, melancholic blast, she knew her true journey, and Japan's, was only just beginning.